There you go. Well, um, this week we're going to continue our discussion on watches, and I wanted to talk about the innovations that made it available for us to wear watches on our wrists or in our pockets. There's a couple of milestones and improvements. I mentioned last week briefly that when they got to adding a minute hand on a watch, or it was because of somebody figured out how to put a spring on a balance wheel. Then it didn't take long for them to say, yeah, that's a good improvement, but we got to figure out a way to make it a little better. And I myself am not aware, but there's a difference between the balance wheel and its spring and a cylinder escapement. You know, in a clock we have a verge, and in a watch they had a verge, but there was a step before the verge went into the watch where there was a cylinder escapement, and and when I looked it up and I tried to figure it out, it appeared to be like a cylinder with a section cut out of it that allowed it to go back and forth and stuff. But the minute hand appeared on watches in Great Britain around 1680, but it wasn't until 1700 that anybody else caught on to it. It was the French that caught on to it. But that cylinder escapement was invented by a guy named Thomas Tompion, and in 1720 that ushered in a change in manufacturing. So the improvements in manufacturing, such as tooth cutting machines and all, then took it out of the hands of individual watchmakers, and then you had machines that actually were cutting gears. And I have to think that was a time in which clocks took a leap forward. 1720. I haven't seen a watch that old in my own collection, but once they started cutting their own, they had machines to cut. Then the finishing and assembling for a period of time remained by hand. Where, okay, so a machine cuts it, but we still like to polish it ourselves, and we still like to assemble the watches ourselves. And in fact, it went well into the 1800s, the 19th century, before they stopped doing all of the polishing and hand assembling of watches themselves. Once they started doing that, and the volume started to increase, then they had to go back and revisit that spring. The spring on the balance wheel was then, they had to figure out how to make a temperature compensating spring where one wouldn't be so affected by temperature. And that's about 1750. They started working on that. And that was probably the single most important improvement with the lever escapement, and the British did that in 1800s, and everybody who was making watches quickly jumped on boards, because then you had machines cutting the gears, and polishing, and you were still hand assembling, but it meant that you had an accurate machine. You then were adding the second bit. We went from only the hour hand, we added the minute hand. We're now adding the seconds bit from about 1800 onward. The British Watch Company modernized the manufacturing of watches, and they actually started calling it a mass production technique. And it was applied about 1843. And for me, in America, there seems to be like this wall where things either happen pre-Civil War or post-Civil War. In Europe, things happen pre or post the war, and but it was like in 1861 that Waltham Watch Company finally came on board and really was started to mass produce watches. The big competition between European watchmakers and American watchmakers, the Waltham Watch Company, came when Waltham showed off their assembly line for assembling watches. And that was at the World's Fair in Philadelphia in 1876. So now we're post, and I talked about that book that talks about then the Swiss started getting involved, and they actually, by espionage and spying and stealing drawings and drawing up and copying the Waltham Watch Company, that the Europeans could then catch up with the technology of not only the mass production, but also the assembling of watches. So that really, in what I've been reading, I've seen the progress of watches and their technology that brought them from something that you carried that looked like a ball to something that you could wear on your wrist. Now, not your wrist, but a pocket. You could carry it in a pocket. It wasn't until actually World War I that we started to see watches being worn on the wrist. In fact, you might have in your collection of wristwatches a pocket watch that had brackets soldered or attached to it, so a band could be worn so that a small pocket watch could then be worn on your wrist. Bob, have you seen any of those? Do you have any in your collection?
Oh yeah, yeah, very early ones. Yeah, they just took a small pocket watch and soldered those on, and you could attach a NATO type strap to it.
Mm-hmm. And that started like in the First World War.
And you'd have a hand free.
That's right. And that happened in the First World War because if you're crawling through trenches, it's kind of hard to find what's in your pockets, right? So absolutely. And I was discussing here with an uncle that came for dinner the other night, and he said that you could tell people that fought in the war that wore wristwatches because instead of wearing it so the watch is on the outside, they wear their watches so the watch is on the inside. I said, well, Albert, tell me why. Because if you're a pilot and you're flying a plane and they're doing bombing and time is everything, timing, you don't have to let go of the wheel to read your watch. I was like, how interesting is that? Pretty cool. But
you'll also occasionally run into one of the little things that they put over the watch face. It looks like a little fence, and it protected your crystal. And I've got a few of those, and it would actually attach to the strap, so it was securely held on over the top of the watch. Because you can imagine if you're wearing it like this, if you set your arm down, you're going to break your crystal.
Yeah, and other things that fashion brought on, I think, was they started painting the dials and they made them luminous. And that was okay if you were in a plane. But if you were working in a trench, you didn't want to have a little light to let somebody know exactly where you are. So actually some leather covers that would close over the top of it, but you would have to lift it off to see the time. But so luminous. So yeah, so we've kind of talked about watches long enough that we've taken it from it was something that was carried and had to maintain time, that only had an hour hand. all the way up through war trenches to now it's on our wrist. And I thought next time we talk about some of the modern watches, the Fitbits, the how quartz watches and battery operated watches were introduced and stuff. And that will kind of close out our talk about watches. And I thought maybe this morning we'd see a couple of the watch guys drop on, but they're watching the videos. So that's it.
Oh,
So,
Frank, to back you up just a little bit, apparently the secret to the American watchmakers came up with was what they call the no-go system, where they would actually have, tolerances in these different parts, and they'd have, one form that was slightly below the tolerance and one that was slightly above the tolerance, and they could put each part into those, and if they passed both those tests, then that part was usable. So then you could just give that to somebody, and they knew that part would be, would be usable, rather than have to hand fitting all these watches like they used to do. So that completely sped up production and made very just slightly experienced people able to put them together, like the production line.
Yeah, and when you say slightly experienced, the AWCI has that class that you can make a watch in a day. I think you have to have slightly experienced people to get
At least
that.
like
Yeah, but
I mean, they didn't need 3 or 4 years of training in order to assemble a watch.
Right, and I've seen pictures of different watch manufacturers, American watch manufacturers, that had rooms filled with people assembling watches, and also then once assembled, testing them, where they had like large boards with maybe 50 watches on them, and to set them for accuracy or regulate them. But when they started mass producing and mass assembling, those kind of things went away.
Was the early watch industry, was that the forerunner of parts interchangeability? I had always heard that guns was a good bit of that, but
well, believe it or not, what was his name? That what was the guy that made the guns? He was originally given the supposed to be the father of mass production, but it turns out that Eli Terry has actually been given that name now, because they found out that, what's the guy's name? Made the cotton gin, and come on, somebody help me out here. But he was
Whitney.
Eli Whitney. Thank you. Yeah, he had a contract with the U.S. government to make muskets for him, and he was basically for many years given the title, the inventor of mass production. Well, apparently he couldn't complete the contract anywhere near on time, and they ended up hand fitting most of the muskets. So he today, when I was doing this research for the tall case clock exhibit, I found this out, that Eli Terry was the one with the Porter contract that he did, where he contracted to make 4,000 tall case clock movements in 3 years. He was actually the first person that did that. But that's how the watchmaking industry in this country, became so powerful. They were able to, figure out a way to make interchangeable parts by using the go no go, testing facility, procedure. So they could make thousands of these parts that were all totally interchangeable with other watches. But yeah, they were one of the main things that got industrialization in this country going, both the clock and the watchmaking industry.
Okay, but it was clock first, and then the watch kind of took over and mimicked that.
Yeah, what Eli Terry did is it was wooden movements he was making, and they'd been making, people had been making movements out of wood just because they could make them a whole lot cheaper than brass, and it was hard to find brass in this country. But he actually set up some kind of a jig where he could make 15 or 20 of these wheels at the same time, and they really haven't figured out exactly what kind of what kind of jig he used. But a few years ago, I think it was Don Bruno, one of the experts on wooden works repair and stuff, came up with something that he thought this is probably how they did it. I mean, they studied the angles that these gears were cut on, because the Porter contract clocks are still out there, and a number of people have a number of museums, and they'll study how the blade cut that piece of wood and all that stuff, to study that and try to figure out what he did. But all that gearing is all gone now, and they'd love to figure out exactly. But yeah, he was the one that literally, they said even today you can take a Porter contract, one of those 4,000 movements, take a piece out of one and put it in the other, and that was in about 1807, I think, somewhere in that range. So very, 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 very early.
Amazing.
Well, is it, and the machining on the bridges in watches and all of that fancy filigree and filling it all in, that became automated really made a difference, I think.
Oh, and made beautiful watches. I mean, they're prettier on the inside than they are on the outside in many cases.
Yeah, let alone the cases. Jewelers were responsible for the cases. The manufacturers started just making the movements and selling the movements, and then they were cased by jewelers.
If you ever get a chance, if you get up to the museum up in Columbia, they've actually got a display of watch case molds. I can't remember which company it was, but the cases they actually stamped these clock or watch cases into. Really, really interesting, really pretty.
And I know there were several watch case makers in Kentucky.
In where? You're breaking up a little bit, Frank.
He said in Kentucky.
In Kentucky? Oh, okay.
Yeah, Ben Hutchinson doesn't, and that's what he collects.
Oh yeah. I've got a number of Kentucky. Well, they're mostly the names of retailers, jewelers that apparently if you bought 10 or 20 watches from a certain company, they would put your name many times on the dial and quite often engrave your name of your company on the back. That the one I showed last week that was Hyde and Goodrich from New Orleans was one of those. And in fact, that was a Swiss watch, but a lot of the American manufacturers did it too, what they call private label.
And that's what they call those, private label.
Right. And you'll find them, and people collect them from all over the country. I've got one, I think, from Nebraska and a number from Kentucky. I think one from Tennessee, now one from New Orleans. Very, very collectible, especially if it's from your area.
And people have said to find them from the South, it's more difficult, or they're fewer in number.
Oh yeah. Very, very difficult. I think a lot of them probably got lost during the Civil War, and the South developed a little bit slower too. So, but you don't see them from the South.
Yeah, and a pocket watch was something of a sign of affluency, and if you weren't affluent, maybe you relied on the church bells to tell you what time it was. Sherry, are you collecting any watches, or your husband's got any watches that are private labels?
Yeah, he's got one from Knoxville, which he was excited about. And I don't know if he's got any others that are private label, but that one from Knoxville is. And as far as what he's doing right now, he had done a spreadsheet of all the watches that he displayed in Florida. And now he's adding other watches that he's got that he didn't take to Florida. So he's busy.
And I know I have a drawer that has started to collect up. And every once in a while, I have a spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm.
What year, who made it, all of those things. It's sometimes it's hard to keep track of. And I guess that's a symbol that maybe you have too many and it's time to, you can't remember them all. So, that's right. So I don't have my sheet with me here about upcoming shows, but I do know the National is coming up. And if you don't have a hotel room, you will be camping, I guess. I don't know. Sleeping in the parking lot. But
I think they've located a few other hotels that their rooms available, but the Marriott is totally sold out. What is it, Sherry? Is it Thursday and
Thursday
Friday?
and Friday night, I think, yeah.
Yeah, not the rooms we had, but literally the entire hotel we have sold out. So
okay, and on Thursday, it was once advertised that there were going to be special tours or things going on at the museum. And
yes.
I've been watching for that, so I make sure I get to sign up and be part of that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, the exhibit is going to be at the museum. So yeah, definitely want to get to the museum. And we're going to have the S-Town exhibit there too. I don't know if you're all familiar with the S-Town podcast. Actually, I'm driving down to Birmingham next weekend and picking up all the items for the exhibit, and Jody and I are going to drive them up to Columbia.
oh, are you going to visit any of the characters that were on the podcast?
Probably meet at least one of them, I think. So yeah.
Make sure you take pictures, selfies.
Yeah,
You're gonna be busy the next 2 weeks, Bob.
a little bit. Yeah, I know
Bit,
not
little
the
bit.
stuff to Jody goes, what? Doing what?
We're doing what? Yeah, that's great. Well, I know Cynthia and I are excited about going to Lexington or Pennsylvania. So we're going to take pictures and all that stuff. We're going to make it a 2-day trip there and a 2-day trip back. So we're not exhausted. So we have lots of energy to help out while we're there. We'll be volunteering. And I encourage
Yes.
anybody who's going to the
Thank you.
National Convention to find out who's collecting the volunteers for the mart, for the auctions, for all of those different things. And raise your hand and say, I'll help out. I know I did that while I was up at the Southern Ohio Regional. I was saying, hey, you guys usually do the auction. How can I help with that? And, it's a lot of fun to be part of and to volunteer. So it's good.
Yeah, and
time.
Frank has volunteered to help us with the mart and security, so we appreciate it, Frank. That's, yeah. Thank you.
We can always use help, and
Yeah.
it is fun. It is fun. Yeah.
It is.
And we'll probably put you to work for the auction too, like we did last year.
Yep.
That was fun.
Yeah, I have to remember to
Go
bring
ahead.
my $40 to the auction because there were some deals last national at the auction. I was carrying out clocks going, I'd like to have this. Wait a minute. Can I bid on this while I'm carrying it around?
Darn, it went for $41. I couldn't afford it.
Just out of my reach. That's it. Well, Ed, are you planning to attend the national?
No, I'll be here. I did make the class up there about a month and a half ago, so.
Oh, good.
Was it good?
Oh, yeah, it was, I learned a lot about a micro lathe, so that was good.
Now, who put that on? What was it, Ken DeLuca or one of the other guys?
Ken was there. There was a guy by the name of, what was his name? I don't know, but he was one of those wizards on a micro lathe. He's been
Jerry Kiefer.
Yeah. He's written articles for different hobby magazines, and his present project is to make a watch. I think a wristwatch, maybe pocket watch. I don't know, but out of stock steel on a lathe, every piece, I think. And he's made one or two. He said he was going to make 3 total.
Wow.
So,
I've heard of people making clocks. Those gears are big enough to address, but to do a watch,
Yeah.
I'd have to get new glasses.
Well, he said he made a model of a 19, I'm gonna get the year wrong, but it's like 1947 Harley 1/8 scale,
Yeah,
and including the rubber and the whole bit. I mean, you know, so I don't know. I mean, he just, but it gave me some inspiration to do lots of other things. So that was good.
that's good. Well,
That's great. Yeah, Ed actually, Tom Hartwine, Julie, and Jody and I had Ken Lewis's estate sale this last weekend. Ed actually came and took several clocks home with him. So have something to keep him busy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
something to work on, something to broaden your understanding. I always look for a clock that, well, I haven't worked on one like this before, or a different movement, or a clock that does something a little differently. I think if I take it apart and restore it and get it back together and working properly, then I've learned something new. So I always like to learn something new. Well, I want to.
Oh, Frank, while I've got you, are you going to be in town next week?
Yes.
I was going to say Monday or Tuesday. Do you think we could get together a Zoom meeting for our chapter relations committee and
Sure. In fact,
half an hour or so?
I'm headed home, halfway home today, and I'll be home tomorrow afternoon.
Okay.
Friday morning, I'll give you a shout.
All right. Well, I'll be in Missouri. So
Misery. Oh,
yeah,
Well,
Missouri.
I'll get you on the cell phone.
All
We'll
right.
figure it out.
Sounds good. All right.
Absolutely. Very good. Well, I want to thank you all for tuning in and paying attention, even though we seem to be clock-minded. It's always interesting to learn a little bit more and think about watches. We can't ignore them because this is a watch and clock, the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors. So we're going to learn more about watches and do more about watches. And that way people won't come up to me at events and say, why don't you ever talk about watches? So we're gonna learn more about them. So
We do and they ignore it.
that's right. I want to thank you all. Remember, if you're out there and around, there's still lots of things to catch. So if you need to, wear a mask, wash your hands, and remember, don't stand so close to me. All right. You guys have a great
Thank
week.
you, Frank. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Have a good trip back.